June 18, 1944, Camp Hearn, Texas. The barbed wire shimmered in the heat, and a German prisoner was ordered into a public library. The order came without ceremony. No shouted commands, no rifles raised, no chains clinking against bone. A young American guard stopped in front of my barracks and said my name as if it were an appointment, not a sentence. His uniform was dusty. His helmet tilted back slightly like he had forgotten to adjust it. He did not look at me the way guards in Europe had looked at prisoners with suspicion sharpened into habit. He looked almost bored. "Come with me," he said. I waited for the rest of it. The accusation, the threat. Nothing followed. We walked out through the inner gate, then the outer gate. The wire parted, then closed behind us. I noticed with a strange clarity that my hands were empty. No cuffs, no rope. My arms swung freely at my sides, and the motion felt unnatural, like walking without a shadow. This had to be a trick. Outside the camp, the world did not look like a battlefield. There were no craters, no smoke, no ruins. The Texas sun pressed down on neat roads and open storefronts. Houses sat calmly behind trimmed lawns. American flags hung from porches barely moving in the still air. A bicycle lay on its side near a curb. Two children chased each other across the street, laughing loudly without glancing at us. Somewhere nearby, a screen door opened and closed. The sound startled me more than artillery ever had. It was the sound of normal life continuing. I had crossed an ocean as an enemy combatant. I had been processed, searched, catalogued. I had prepared myself for humiliation, for punishment, for the long, slow erasure of dignity. I had not prepared myself for this. The guard led me down a quiet street toward a low brick building. White columns, wide windows. A sign above the door painted in simple letters, "Public Library." I stopped walking. My feet refused to move as if my body had recognized danger before my mind could explain it. The guard took 2 more steps, then turned back and looked at me. "You coming?" he asked. This had to be it. Back home, books were never neutral. They were counted approved, corrected. Words could condemn you. A wrong sentence, a wrong author, and your loyalty was questioned. Libraries were not places you wandered into. They were places you were summoned to. I had seen books burned in city squares. I had watched pages curl into black ash while crowds cheered, convinced that ideas could be destroyed by fire. I had learned early that reading was not an innocent act. It was political, dangerous. And now my enemy was walking me unarmed into a building full of books. I followed him because prisoners learn quickly that refusing orders invites consequences. But every step felt like stepping deeper into an unseen trap. Perhaps this was interrogation by another name. Perhaps I would be asked to read to agree to absorb something subtle and poisonous. The door opened without resistance. No guard post, no metal detector. Just the smell of paper and dust and something else I could not immediately identify. Quiet. Inside, the air was cool. Sunlight fell through tall windows onto long wooden tables. Shelves rose in clean rows filled not with propaganda posters or slogans, but with spines of every color and thickness. People moved slowly, deliberately. An older man turned a page. A woman whispered to a child. No one looked up when we entered. No one flinched. The guard gestured toward a desk near the center of the room. An older woman stood behind it adjusting a stack of cards. Her hair was gray, pulled back neatly. She wore glasses and a plain dress. There was no uniform, no insignia. She looked at me the way a teacher looks at a late student, not with suspicion but with expectation. "What's your name?" she asked. I gave it to her. She wrote it down carefully as if the act mattered. Then she slid a small rectangle of stiff paper across the desk, a library card. "Read anything you want," she said. That was all. No conditions, no instructions, no warning. For a moment I did not understand what she had said. The words made no sense in the order she had placed them. Read anything you want. I waited for the second sentence. It never came. The guard leaned against a wall, uninterested. The librarian had already turned to help someone else. The card sat between us, an object so small it should not have carried weight, yet it felt heavier than any rifle I had surrendered. I walked past the desk as if the floor might collapse beneath me. The shelves stretched on, labeled in simple handwriting: history, science, literature, philosophy. American authors stood beside British ones, French, Russian, and then impossibly German. I reached out without thinking. My fingers brushed a familiar name. Goethe. Not in German, in English. My hand began to shake. I had read these words as a boy before uniforms and slogans had claimed them. Before reading had become something you did quietly, cautiously. I pulled the book from the shelf and held it as if it might vanish if I loosened my grip. No one stopped me. No one watched. I sat down at a table near the window. Outside, a woman crossed the street carrying groceries. A truck passed slowly, its engine humming. The war felt impossibly far away. This was wrong. America was at war on two fronts. 12 million men in uniform. Factories running day and night, entire cities reorganized around victory. And yet, here in a small Texas town, the library was open. Children still borrowed books. Elderly men still read newspapers in peace. Even during war, they kept libraries open. I stared at the page but could not read the words yet. Something else was happening. Something deeper and more unsettling than fear. This was not cruelty. This was not propaganda. This was confidence. The confidence to believe that ideas did not need guarding, that books did not need chains, that even an enemy could be trusted with thought. I had crossed oceans expecting to be broken. Instead, on a quiet street in Texas, my enemy handed me a book and waited to see what I would do with it. And for the first time since the war began, I did not know which side truly held the power. I did not open the book right away. I sat there, hands resting on the cover, listening to the quiet hum of the room, waiting for the moment when someone would interrupt me. Years of training had taught me that silence was never empty. Silence was where the danger hid. Back home, books had taught me fear before they taught me ideas. I was 16 the first time I watched a bonfire made of paper. It was evening, and the square smelled of smoke and excitement. People cheered as if something diseased were being destroyed. A teacher stood nearby, nodding in approval, his hands folded behind his back. Titles were read aloud before being thrown into the flames. Each name drew a reaction. Laughter, applause, satisfaction. We were told the fire was necessary, that certain ideas weakened the nation, that dangerous thoughts crept in through pages quietly and visibly until loyalty itself began to rot. After that, bookshelves changed. Some books disappeared overnight. Others were moved to locked cabinets. Authors we once studied were no longer mentioned. When new books arrived, they arrived with introductions explaining how they were to be read, what conclusions were acceptable, which passages mattered, and which did not. Thinking was allowed, but only within narrow lanes. I learned to read the way one learns to cross a minefield. Slowly, carefully, always aware of where not to step. By the time I was conscripted, the habit was complete. Ideas did not belong to individuals. They belonged to the state. Reading was not a private act. It was a responsibility, a duty, something that could be judged. So, when the American librarian said, "Read anything you want," my mind rejected the sentence outright. There was no such thing as anything you want. Not for a soldier, not for a prisoner, not for a German. I looked up from the table and scanned the room again, this time with intent. I studied faces. An older woman reading near the window, a young man flipping through a magazine, a child leaning against his mother's leg, bored. None of them paid me any attention. That somehow was worse. If this was propaganda, it was unlike anything I had been taught to expect. There were no posters, no slogans, no friendly Americans hovering nearby ready to guide my thinking in the correct direction. Instead, there was indifference. The thought unsettled me more than hostility ever had. I tried to imagine the purpose of this place in American hands. Perhaps this was interrogation without questions. Perhaps they believed that if they gave us books, we would betray ourselves, our doubts, our weaknesses, our disillusionment simply by what we chose to read. Maybe someone was watching somewhere unseen, noting which titles I touched, which pages I lingered on. Maybe this was a test of loyalty disguised as generosity. I forced myself to open the book. The paper was thick, the print clear, no stamps, no warnings, no margins filled with instructions, just text. It felt wrong. I read a paragraph, then another. My eyes moved automatically trained by years of discipline, but my mind refused to relax. Every sentence felt like a trap door. I kept expecting the language to shift to reveal itself as something else. It did not. Around me, the library remained stubbornly ordinary. A chair scraped softly against the floor. Someone coughed. Pages turned. I noticed how the light fell across the tables, not harsh, not dramatic, but steady. The kind of light meant to be lived under, not staged. The tables were scarred with small marks from decades of use. Names carved into wood. Initials, dates. This place had a history longer than the war. That realization carried weight. Germany had remade its institutions to serve the war. Schools, universities, publishing houses, everything bent toward a single purpose. Even leisure was organized, supervised, shaped. Here, the war seemed to exist outside the walls. I thought of the night the bookshop near our apartment closed. No announcement, no explanation. The windows were boarded up. Inside, shelves were empty. A sign on the door said the shop was being reorganized in the interest of the people. It never reopened. Ideas, we were told, were too important to be left uncontrolled. Now I sat in an enemy country where ideas sat openly on shelves unguarded, accessible to anyone who walked through the door. The contradiction made my chest tighten. I thought of the speeches we had listened to before deployment. We had been warned that America was decadent, chaotic, incapable of discipline. That its freedoms were illusions masking moral weakness. That its people lacked unity and therefore relied on manipulation rather than strength. And yet, nothing in this room matched that description. There was order here, but it was quiet, voluntary. People followed rules because they believed in them, not because they were forced. No one told the child to be silent. He simply learned it by watching others. The realization frightened me. If this was how Americans treated their own people, what did that say about how they treated prisoners? What did it say about the war itself? I remembered the Geneva Convention being mentioned during training, dismissed as something the enemy pretended to follow. Paper promises, we were told. Meaningless once bullets started flying. But this was not paper. This was practice. No one needed to explain the rules here. They lived them. Civilians, soldiers, even enemies existed within the same framework of dignity. The library did not change because the nation was at war. It did not close its doors or narrow its shelves. It simply continued. I looked again at the people around me. None of them seemed afraid. Not of ideas, not of difference, not even of me. To them, I was a man reading a book, nothing more. The absence of suspicion pressed in on me. I had been prepared for cruelty. I had prepared myself to endure it, to survive it. I had not prepared myself to be trusted. Fear took a different shape then. Not sharp, not immediate, but slow and consuming. Fear of what this meant. Fear of what it revealed. If my enemy could afford this kind of openness in the middle of total war, then perhaps everything I had been taught about strength was wrong. Perhaps power did not come from control alone. Perhaps it came from confidence so complete it did not fear dissent even from an enemy. That thought was dangerous. I closed the book and sat very still, my heart beating harder than it ever had under fire. The library did not change. No alarms sounded. No one intervened. The danger was not in the room. It was in my mind. For the first time, I understood why books had been burned back home. Not because they were weak, but because they were powerful. Not because they lied, but because they made space for doubt. And sitting there in a quiet American library, I realized something that filled me with unease and reluctant respect. My enemy was not afraid of that space at all. The woman behind the desk did not look like anyone who should have power over me. She was not a soldier, not an officer, not even particularly interested in what I was doing. Her hands moved with practiced ease, stamping dates, straightening cards, returning books to their proper place. She had done this work for years, perhaps decades. War had not elevated her. It had not transformed her into something symbolic. She was simply a librarian, continuing the same quiet routine she had followed long before anyone decided to march across oceans. That more than anything else unsettled me. In Germany, authority announced itself. It wore uniforms. It demanded attention. It reminded you constantly of its presence. Even kindness, when it existed, arrived with explanations, conditions, expectations. Here, there was none of that. I stood at the desk waiting for something more. A question, a warning, a reminder that I was still an enemy. The librarian glanced up once briefly as if to check whether I needed help finding a shelf. "You can keep it for 2 weeks," she said, tapping the card lightly. "Bring it back if you want more time." "If you want." The words landed softly without emphasis, and that softness carried weight. There was no test embedded in her voice, no hint of performance. She did not lower her tone to sound generous, nor did she raise it to assert authority. She spoke to me the way she spoke to everyone else. I took the card and stepped away, half expecting someone to stop me. No one did. The guard remained near the entrance, leaning against the wall, arms crossed loosely. He watched the room with the indifference of someone assigned to a place that did not require vigilance. He did not watch me. I moved between the shelves, slowly reading labels as if they might change when I looked away. History, philosophy, science, fiction. The shelves were not curated to make a point. They were messy, uneven, shaped by years of donations and use. New books sat beside old ones. Some spines were worn smooth by hands. Others looked untouched. I pulled a book at random from the history section. An American account of the Civil War. I opened it and read a few pages. It did not flatter its own side. It spoke of mistakes, division, suffering. It named failures plainly. That surprised me. In Germany, history suggested inevitability. Victories were portrayed as destiny. Defeats were either ignored or reframed as temporary setbacks caused by betrayal or weakness elsewhere. Here, history appeared less certain, less obedient. I returned the book and moved on. Philosophy occupied a quiet corner near the back. Names I recognized sat beside ones I did not. Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche. Translated, annotated, debated, rather than revered. Next to them stood American thinkers, Emerson, Thoreau, writing about individual conscience, civil disobedience, the value of standing apart from the crowd. No labels warned me away. No sections were roped off. German thinkers were not hidden. They were not removed because of the war. They were simply there, part of a larger conversation. I thought of the libraries back home, how shelves had been rearranged, how certain names vanished. I thought of professors who stopped assigning particular texts, not because they disagreed with them, but because disagreement itself had become dangerous. Here, disagreement seemed assumed. The realization crept in slowly, unwelcome, but undeniable. This was not kindness designed to persuade me. It did not attempt to reshape my loyalty or soften my resistance through charm. It did not ask anything of me in return. It was kindness without performance. That was its most disarming quality. I walked past a table where an older man sat reading a newspaper. He glanced up at me briefly, nodded once, and returned to his page. No curiosity, no hostility, just acknowledgement. I had been prepared to be watched. I had not been prepared to be ignored. In that indifference lay a kind of respect I had not experienced before. Not admiration, not approval. Simply the assumption that I was capable of choosing reading thinking without supervision. The library card felt warm in my pocket. I paused near a window and looked outside. The street remained calm. A woman pushed a stroller past the building. A delivery truck stopped briefly, then moved on. Somewhere a church bell rang, the hour its sound carrying easily through open air. Life continued. I thought of my mother, how she used to take me to the small library near our apartment when I was a child, how she would let me wander while she searched for something specific, how she trusted that I would find my way back to her. That trust had disappeared years before the war began. Now, in an enemy country, it had returned in an unexpected form. The librarian passed by me carrying a small stack of books. She smiled politely, not warmly, not coldly, just the habitual smile of someone accustomed to sharing space with strangers. She did not slow her pace. She did not look at the uniform I no longer wore. For her, I was not a symbol. I was a reader. That simplicity was profound. I began to understand something about the country I was standing in. America did not perform its values loudly. It embedded them into ordinary systems, libraries, schools, civic spaces so deeply that no one thought to question them. The generosity here did not announce itself because it did not need to. It was not fragile. It did not fear exploitation. It assumed that if you gave people access to ideas, they would find their own way through them. That assumption required confidence. Confidence born not of arrogance, but of stability. Of a society that trusted its foundations enough to let enemies walk freely among its books. This was the generation that had grown up during the Depression. People who had stood in breadlines and still believed in shared institutions. Who had seen hardship without abandoning the idea that public spaces mattered. They did not need to explain morality. They practiced it quietly. I realized then that the most unsettling thing about this place was not what it offered me, but how little it expected in return. There was no gratitude demanded, no transformation required. I did not have to become American to sit at these tables. I only had to read. As I moved back toward my seat, the thought struck me with sudden clarity. If this was how America treated an enemy at war, how did it treat its own people? The answer surrounded me. Not with spectacle, not with speeches, but with open doors, worn tables and shelves full of books, waiting patiently for whoever chose to reach for them. The war had taught me to measure power in weapons, in discipline, in control. Standing there holding a book I was free to read or abandon, I began to sense a different kind of strength at work, one that did not need to prove itself. I saw the name before I touched the book. It stood there on the spine, familiar and impossible at the same time, as if it had followed me across the ocean without permission. Goethe. The letters were clean, unadorned, printed without ceremony. Below the name, smaller text, selected works. And beneath that in parentheses a quiet detail that made my breath catch English translation. For a moment, I did not move. My body reacted before my mind could catch up. My fingers tightened, then loosened. My heart began to beat faster, not with fear this time, but with something closer to disbelief. I glanced around the aisle, expecting someone to step out from between the shelves and tell me this did not belong here. No one did. The book remained where it was balanced among others, neither hidden nor elevated. I reached for it slowly, as if it might recoil at my touch. When my fingers closed around the spine, a tremor ran through my hand. The sensation surprised me. I had carried rifles. I had dragged wounded men. I had not shaken like this. I pulled the book free and opened it at random. The language was different, but the voice was unmistakable. The rhythm, the thought, the way questions were posed without offering easy answers. Goethe had always written as if he trusted the reader to follow him to wrestle with meaning rather than receive it neatly packaged. That trust had been the first thing taken from his work back home. I remembered the first time I read him. I was 13, sitting at the small table in our apartment while rain tapped against the window. My mother had brought the book home from the library, her finger pressed against the place she thought I should begin. There was no lesson attached. No explanation of what I was meant to conclude. "Just read," she said. I did. The words had felt larger than the room, larger than the city even. They asked questions I did not yet know how to answer, and somehow that felt like permission rather than failure. Years later, when I read him again in school, the tone had changed. The text was the same, but the framing was different. Passages were highlighted, interpretations were suggested. Certain ideas were emphasized while others were passed over quickly as if lingering might be dangerous. By the time I wore a uniform, Goethe's words had been reduced to examples of national genius, of cultural superiority, of ideas pressed into service. I closed the book and held it against my chest. I had not realized how much I missed him until that moment. Not the author himself, but what he represented, a time when reading was an act of curiosity, not allegiance. I carried the book to a table near the window and sat down. The chair creaked softly beneath my weight. Sunlight pooled on the wood, warming my hands. Outside, the street remained unchanged, indifferent to the small collapse happening inside me. No one followed. No one watched. I opened the book again and began to read from the beginning this time, forcing myself to slow down to let the English settle. The translation was careful, respectful. It did not explain itself. It trusted the reader. That trust pressed against something fragile inside me. As I read, images rose unbidden, not of war, but of before. Of my father reading the newspaper in the evenings, pipe smoke curling toward the ceiling. Of my mother humming softly as she cooked. Of conversations that drifted from politics to music to nothing at all, unafraid of where they might lead. Those conversations had disappeared long before the bombs fell. By 1944, Germany was a country of whispers and ruins. Cities flattened into gray expanses. Streets reduced to memory. Universities hollowed out their lecture halls, cold and empty, their brightest minds scattered, silenced, or repurposed. Books still existed, but they had been narrowed, fenced in by acceptable conclusions. Thought had been disciplined into obedience. I thought of Berlin, of the photographs we had seen, entire neighborhoods erased. I thought of friends who once argued passionately about art and philosophy, now reduced to repeating slogans with careful enthusiasm. I thought of how easily it had all happened, how quietly. And then I thought of where I was sitting. America, in 1944, was also at war. Its factories thundered day and night, producing weapons in numbers we could scarcely imagine. Bombers rolled off assembly lines while radios crackled with news from distant fronts. Entire families had sons overseas. Entire towns lived with absence. And yet, here in the midst of that effort, a public library stood open. Not guarded, not restricted, not repurposed for the war. They were building machines of destruction and preserving places of thought at the same time. The contrast struck me with a force I could not deflect. We had told ourselves that war required narrowing, that survival demanded control. America seemed to believe something else, that war did not excuse the abandonment of what made peace worth returning to. I read on, but the words blurred. My eyes burned. I set the book down and pressed my fingers against the bridge of my nose, willing the sensation to pass. It did not. Tears gathered unexpectedly, uninvited. I had not cried when I surrendered. I had not cried on the transport ship or in the camp, or during long nights staring at unfamiliar stars. Hunger had not broken me. Fear had not broken me. This did. I lowered my head shoulders rounding inward and let the tears fall onto the open page. They came quietly, without sobs or sound. Just a steady release, as if something held too tightly for too long had finally been allowed to loosen. I cried because no one was watching. I cried because no one cared what I read. I cried because my enemy had trusted me with something my own country no longer did with my own thoughts. The library did not react. The room remained as it had been, calm, ordinary, patient. A page turned somewhere behind me. A chair scraped lightly across the floor. I stayed there for a long time, head bowed, breathing slowly, until the storm passed. When I finally looked up, the light had shifted slightly, angling across the table in a different way. Time had moved on without marking the moment. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and laughed once softly at the absurdity of it. Here I was, a captured enemy soldier, breaking down not under interrogation or deprivation, but under the weight of being treated as a thinking human being. I picked up the book again, this time more carefully, and closed it. The cover felt solid beneath my fingers. In Germany, power had been enforced by narrowing the mind. In America, power seemed to rest in refusing to do so, even when it would have been easier. That realization settled heavily, not as comfort, but as truth. I sat there until the tears dried completely, until my breathing steadied, until I could trust my voice not to betray me if I needed it. When I finally stood, no one remarked on my red eyes. No one asked questions. The librarian did not glance up. I returned the book to my seat, placed it carefully in front of me, and opened it once more. This time, I was ready to read. Not as a soldier, not as a prisoner, but as a man who had just discovered how much damage can be undone not by force, but by trust. For the first time, my enemy did not tell me what to think. The sentence formed slowly in my mind, not as a declaration, but as an observation, quiet, undeniable. It carried no triumph, no bitterness. It simply described what had happened. I had been given a choice and left alone with it. That was new. In the world I came from, choices were curated. Paths were marked clearly, and stepping off them required courage most people did not possess or could not afford. Thought itself had been organized into ranks, drilled into formation, taught to move on command. Here, there were no commands. I returned to my seat and opened the book again, not to escape the feeling, but to test it. I wanted to see if the freedom I sensed would vanish the moment I leaned on it. It did not. The words remained where they were. The meaning waited patiently, offering itself without instruction. It occurred to me then that this was not an accident of kindness or an oversight of war. This was design. America's strength, I began to understand, was not only in what it produced, but in what it trusted. It trusted individuals to read without supervision, to think without guidance, to reach conclusions that might not align perfectly with any prescribed doctrine. The trust required something deeper than confidence in weapons or factories. It required confidence in people. I had seen the scale of American industry on the journey west. Endless fields. Trains that seemed never to end. Factories that worked without pause. We had measured that power in numbers planes per month, ships per year, tonnage of steel. But, sitting there in a quiet library, it became clear that this visible strength rested on an invisible foundation, a belief that ideas could circulate freely without tearing the country apart, a belief that disagreement did not weaken unity, a belief that individuals given access to thought would choose responsibility more often than chaos. In Germany, we had been told the opposite, that freedom of thought led inevitably to decay, that control was the price of order, that too much questioning would dissolve loyalty, and perhaps I realized that fear said more about us than it did about freedom. I thought of how quickly we had narrowed our thinking once the war began, how easily complexity had been sacrificed for clarity, how suspicion had replaced trust as the organizing principle of public life. It had felt efficient. necessary, patriotic. It had also hollowed us out. The Americans, facing the same pressures of war, had made a different calculation. They mobilized industry, yes. They rationed, recruited, disciplined. But they did not close their libraries. They did not silence debate entirely. They did not treat ideas as liabilities to be managed. They treated them as assets. The realization unsettled me, because it suggested that strength did not require uniformity, that a nation could endure disagreement and still stand firm, that the presence of doubt did not signal weakness but resilience. I looked around the library again this time with different eyes. This place was not merely tolerated during wartime. It was preserved, protected, maintained. The lights were on. The doors were open. The shelves were full. This was not defiance of war, it was faith. Faith that when the war ended, there would still be something worth returning to. Faith that the habits of free thought were not luxuries to be postponed, but necessities to be guarded. I wondered how many American soldiers had passed through places like this before being shipped overseas. How many had sat at these tables reading quietly, carrying those habits with them into the chaos of combat. Perhaps that was part of what sustained them, the knowledge that what they were fighting for existed not only in speeches, but in rooms like this. I realized then that freedom did not announce itself loudly here. It did not demand recognition. It did not insist on gratitude. It was offered matter-of-factly like a chair pulled out at a table. Take it or leave it. That quietness was deceptive. It made freedom harder to attack, harder to caricature. There was no single symbol to destroy, no central authority to overthrow. Freedom lived in ordinary routines and unremarkable decisions repeated daily. It lived in a librarian who asked for your name and nothing else. I closed the book and rested my hands on the table, feeling the grain of the wood beneath my palms. I thought of all the ways my country had tried to engineer belief to enforce unity through control. I thought of how brittle that unity had become under pressure. America's unity, I began to see, was built differently. It was not enforced from above, but reinforced from below through shared access to institutions that assumed competence and responsibility. That assumption carried risk. Some people would misuse freedom. Some ideas would clash. Some disagreements would cut deep. But America seemed willing to bear that risk. The courage of that choice impressed me more than any display of force. I understood then that the power I was witnessing did not depend on my conversion. It did not require me to admire America, or to agree with it, or even to like it. It functioned regardless of my response. That was the final, unsettling realization. This system did not need me. It did not need my obedience or my gratitude to validate itself. It existed because millions of ordinary people chose every day to keep it alive, to keep the doors open, the lights on, the books circulating. I thought of the camps, of the fences, of the guards who treated us firmly but fairly, of the meals served without humiliation, of the rules explained rather than imposed arbitrarily. All of it pointed in the same direction. This was not mercy as spectacle, not kindness as strategy, but dignity as default. The implications sank in, slowly rearranging my understanding of the war itself. If America could afford this openness in the middle of total war, then perhaps its confidence ran deeper than I had imagined. Perhaps it believed that the real contest was not only over territory or resources, but over which way of organizing human life could endure without collapsing inward. I returned the book to the table and sat quietly for a while longer, letting the thought settle. Outside, the afternoon light had softened. Shadows stretched across the street. Somewhere, a radio played faintly, its melody drifting in through an open window. The world continued. When I finally stood to leave, the library card rested securely in my pocket. It felt less like a privilege now, and more like a responsibility, one I had not asked for but had been entrusted with nonetheless. As I walked toward the door, I understood something that would stay with me long after the war ended. America's strength was not only in its ability to command obedience, but in its willingness to extend trust even to those who might reject it. That willingness, I realized, was not naive. It was deliberate. And for the first time standing on enemy soil, I felt something unexpected rise alongside my unease. Respect. I did not return to Texas until decades later. By then, the war had long since hardened into history. Borders had shifted. Flags had changed. The men who once guarded fences and stamped library cards had grown old if they were still alive at all. I was no longer the man who had walked out of Camp Hearn in borrowed calm and borrowed trust. I was heavier now, slower, carrying memories that no longer asked permission before surfacing. The town looked smaller than I remembered. The road into it had widened, but the buildings seemed lower, less imposing. Some storefronts were gone. Others had changed names, purposes, owners. The library still stood where it had been. Though the paint was newer, the sign updated, the windows replaced. I stood across the street for a long time before crossing. I was not afraid of going in. That fear belonged to another life. What unsettled me was something else, the question of whether the feeling would still be there or whether it had only ever existed in memory. Inside, the air smelled different, cleaner, less dust, more polish. The tables were lighter, the chairs more uniform. Computers hummed softly where newspapers once lay folded. People moved with the same quiet efficiency, but their eyes flicked up more often, more quickly. No one recognized me. Of course they wouldn't. Time had erased the visible signs of who I had been. There was no uniform now, no accent strong enough to draw attention. I could have been anyone, a visitor, a local, a passerby, curious about a building he remembered. That anonymity felt appropriate. I walked the aisles slowly, letting my hand trail along the spines. The categories had expanded. New authors had appeared, others had faded. Goethe was still there, translated again and again, each version reflecting the era that produced it. The book waited patiently, unchanged in its willingness to be read. As I stood there, another presence joined me. My son, then later my granddaughter, listening as I told them why this place mattered. They had grown up in a different world, one shaped by screens and speed, by arguments that moved faster than understanding. They listened politely, respectfully, but I could tell that what I described felt distant to them, almost abstract. A different America, a different time. Outside the library, the country had changed in ways harder to name but easier to feel. In 1944, America had been unified by necessity. The war demanded it. Differences existed certainly, but they were held together by a shared direction. Production hummed within its borders. Factories belonged to towns. Towns belonged to people who knew one another's names. Confidence ran deep, not arrogance, but assurance. The belief that institutions, though imperfect, were worth defending. That disagreement did not require destruction. Now, decades later, the unity I remembered seemed thinner. Production had scattered across oceans. What had once been made within sight of home now arrived on ships from elsewhere. The connection between effort and outcome had grown abstract, harder to trace. Trust, too, had changed. In 1944, Americans argued fiercely, but they argued within a shared framework. They trusted that elections mattered, that public spaces belonged to everyone, that institutions, though flawed, were capable of correction. Now suspicion appeared more common, not just of enemies, but of one another. Motives were questioned before words were heard. Intent was assumed to be hostile more often than not. I did not judge this change. I had lived long enough to know that every generation inherits its own fears. But, standing there between shelves that had once given me back a piece of myself, I could not help comparing. Then unity born of shared sacrifice. Now division sharpened by constant noise. Then factories that anchored communities. Now systems so vast they felt untouchable. Then moral confidence that did not require shouting. Now uncertainty that demanded it. Then, trust in institutions as imperfect but necessary. Now, doubt that treated every structure as suspect. None of this made America weaker necessarily, but it made it louder, more defensive, less certain of what it was protecting. I watched a young man at a nearby table scrolling through a screen, headphones pressed tight against his ears. I wondered what ideas reached him and how often they were challenged. I wondered whether the quiet confidence I had encountered decades earlier could survive in a world that rewarded outrage more than reflection. The question rose again, uninvited and persistent. Would an enemy still be given a library card today? Not as a gesture, not as a symbol, but as a matter of routine. Would trust still be extended quietly without explanation, without expectation of return? I did not know the answer. Perhaps the question itself was unfair. Times change. Threats evolve. Certainties dissolve. What had been possible in one moment might be impossible in another. And yet, I could not dismiss the comparison entirely. What struck me was not that America had changed, change was inevitable, but that the quiet confidence I had once encountered felt rarer, as if trust itself had become a resource to be guarded, rationed, defended. I remembered the librarian's voice, calm and unremarkable. Read anything you want. There had been no hesitation in it, no calculation, no fear of consequence. That moment had not required agreement. It had not required conversion. It had only required belief in the resilience of free thought and in the strength of a society that could tolerate it. I looked again at my granddaughter standing beside me, fingers tracing titles she might never read. I wondered what kind of country she would inherit, whether she would ever experience that same quiet assurance, that sense of being trusted before being judged. The library remained open. The doors still welcomed anyone who walked through them. In that sense, nothing essential had been lost. And yet, I felt the distance. Not as accusation, not as lament, as a question. One that lingered long after we stepped back onto the street, long after the doors closed behind us, long after the building receded into the background of a changed America. Would trust still come first? Or had fear learned once again to speak louder than confidence? My grandfather never spoke much about the war, not because he wanted to forget it, but because he believed memory carried responsibility. When he did speak, it was never about battles or suffering measured in numbers. It was always about moments. Small, precise moments that had shaped the rest of his life. The library was one of them. I grew up hearing the story in fragments, never dramatic, never embellished. He would mention Texas, a small town, a quiet building, a book he had not expected to see again, and then he would fall silent as if the meaning of it could not be improved by explanation. Only when he grew older did he finally put it into words. He wrote a letter, not to a government, not to an institution, but to a country. He did not ask me to send it anywhere, he only asked that it be kept. Years later, I read it. To the people of the United States, I do not write this as an apology because apologies belong to those who committed wrongs, and I was a young man swept into something larger than himself. I do not write this to ask forgiveness because forgiveness cannot be demanded or owed. I write only to give thanks. In 1944, I was your enemy. I wore a uniform that stood against everything you were fighting for. I arrived in your country prepared to be broken. Instead, I was trusted, not with secrets, not with power, but with a book. You did not ask me to agree with you. You did not ask me to change. You did not ask me to confess anything at all. You gave me the right to think freely. And then you left me alone with that responsibility. That moment did not end the war, but it ended something else, something quieter and more lasting. It taught me that strength does not always raise its voice. Sometimes it opens a door and steps aside. For that, my family remains grateful. When my grandfather died, the letter remained. It passed to my father, then to me. It became part of our family's inheritance not as a relic of shame, but as evidence of something rare. Evidence that even in war, choices exist. That even when cruelty is permitted, restraint can still be chosen. And America did not have to do what it did. It did not have to feed prisoners well. It did not have to follow conventions faithfully. It did not have to keep its libraries open. It had the power to be harsh. No one would have stopped it. Instead, it chose to remain itself. That choice shaped my grandfather more than captivity ever did. It shaped the way he raised his children, the way he spoke about enemies, the way he treated disagreement not as something to destroy, but as something to engage. He returned to Germany a changed man, not because he had been re-educated, but because he had been respected. He rebuilt his life slowly. He taught, he read, he encouraged questions in his home even when answers were uncomfortable. He told us that freedom was fragile, not because it was weak, but because it required constant care. And always behind those lessons stood that quiet American library. For Americans watching this story, perhaps the details feel distant. A different era, a different war, a different country, but the values remain close. They live in ordinary places, in unremarkable people, in decisions made without witnesses. The United States won the war not only because it could outproduce its enemies, but because it refused to become them. It held on to humanity when it had every excuse to abandon it. That is not a small thing. History remembers who won the war, but my family remembers who trusted my grandfather with a book when they didn't have to. That trust crossed borders. It crossed generations. It crossed the distance between enemy and human being. And it remains quietly as proof that even in the darkest moments of history, the greatest strength is not found in domination, but in dignity. That is the inheritance he left us, and it is one worth remembering.